The gallery was jammed shoulder to shoulder when a white cop went at Malcolm Reddick, a black Navy SEAL with decorations to his name, as the judge stared on, wordless. The whole room locked up, everyone frozen by the audacity of it. They didn't know a twist was already marching their way. Minutes later, those doors would fly open, and military police would flood the courtroom like a breaking tide, boots striking marble, changing the balance in a single breath. How does a courthouse tumble from smug certainty into absolute turmoil in under a minute? If this fires you up, hit like and pass it on, because what happens inside won't believe itself. Here's where it begins. The heavy doors eased, and in stepped Malcolm Reddick. He was 40 now, a combat-tempered Black SEAL, salt water and fire stitched into his history. But in the temple of justice, they'd just unhooked the cuffs like he was contraband. He didn't push back. He didn't plead. He walked with that fixed, quiet confidence, the kind that unsettles people who crave fear. He sat at the defense table, back straight as a ruler, hands folded like a ceremony. His face was a closed book. No heat, no protest, just a measured stillness. For some, that calm felt provocative. Across the aisle, Officer Clayton Hargrove lounged, letting his swagger fill the space like smoke curling toward a ceiling fan. Hargrove, mid-40s, and built like a doorframe, wore a smirk that said the verdict was already penciled in. From the second Malcolm crossed the threshold, Clayton tracked him like quarry. He didn't register the trident pin or the tours or the citations. None of it flickered. He saw a black man in a defendant's chair, and for him that was fuel enough. Up on the bench, Judge Everett Langford, silver hair thinning, regarded it all with practiced gravity. He was famous for a tight courtroom and a short fuse for nonsense, but there was something in the way his gaze slid from Malcolm to Hargrove, a near invisible tilt that made the room feel uneven. Clayton's curled lip went unchecked, like the scales were tipped before the oath books even opened. Beside Malcolm sat his court-appointed lawyer, Terrence Terry Boyd, mid-40s, neat navy suit, voice even as a metronome, posture correct, spirit strangely dulled. Boyd spoke like a man discharging a civic task, not someone ready to scrap for his client's life. Each time Hargrove shifted noisily or cleared his throat with contempt, Boyd's eyes flickered toward him, brittle and wary, bracing for weather he didn't know how to face. The seats behind them hummed with low whispers, a reporter's pen ticking in bursts. They hadn't come only for a case. They'd come for a headline. Black SEAL brought up on misconduct. The crowd leaned in, waiting for Malcolm to speak, explain, argue, light a fuse. He gave them nothing. To many, that wordless composure read like surrender. To Hargrove, it looked like triumph. Clayton leaned toward the prosecution with a grin you could hear. Figures, he murmured, just loud enough for nearby ears. Big Navy hero who can't muster a sentence. Boyd's shoulders tightened. He didn't object. The judge didn't caution. The insult hung, mean, and deliberate. It stung, not because Malcolm recoiled, but because he didn't. His silence wasn't hollow. It was weighted, like a heavy door waiting for the right push. He wasn't playing their game, and his refusal to dance only made the room more uneasy. Judge Langford tapped the gavel once, bringing the buzz down. "This court will come to order," he said. The words carried authority, but his eyes landed longest on Malcolm, not curious, suspicious. The trial was barely breathing, and yet you could taste the imbalance on the air. It wasn't only Malcolm on trial. It was his very standing, his right to meet this room as an equal. Boyd shuffled papers, cleared his throat, and began his opening. He spoke of fairness, presumption, the burden the state must shoulder. But the words hovered instead of landing. Hargrove leaned back, whispering with the prosecutor. A muffled laugh. They weren't worried. Not about Boyd. Not about Malcolm. Meanwhile, Malcolm kept still as stone, eyes front, hands quiet. A posture that should earn respect was recast as passivity in that room. The unspoken message was ugly. A quiet black man under a white officer's contempt. the system's preferred picture. But Malcolm's quiet wasn't capitulation. It was coiled presence, the kind that hums like a storm, forming past the horizon. In the closing minutes of that first hour, Clayton decided to goad him head on. He leaned forward and pitched his voice for the benches to hear. Think that uniform puts you above me? He barked. Not here. In here, you're nothing. The words cracked across the courtroom. A few gasps. A pen stopped mid-scratch. Boyd froze. The judge adjusted his glasses but let it hang, as if the insult belonged to the proceedings. Malcolm turned his head for the first time, slowly, finding Hargrove's eyes with a gaze that didn't blink. No words, just a stare with more weight than any shout. The room stilled. Some who had pegged Malcolm as weak felt the axis tilt. His quiet wasn't fragility. It was a warning whispered in steel. Few recognized it yet, but that steady look was the first fracture in the facade, a hairline crack that would widen and split the room apart. The rhythm faltered. Hargrove, fed by permissiveness and Boyd's restraint, pressed the gas. Typical, Clayton announced, loud enough for the jurors to catch it. Another thug who thinks a uniform makes him somebody. Navy or not, you're still just another black criminal in the right chair. It hit like a slap. A corner of the gallery tensed. Way back, someone snickered. Ugly. Eager. Malcolm didn't move. His face was a calm horizon. That stillness wasn't detachment. It was concentration, cut like glass. Hargrove saw it and ground his teeth. Look at him, Clayton sneered, twisting to the audience like a performer. He won't even defend himself. Means I'm right. A woman in the front row lowered her eyes, lips pressed thin. The man beside her shook his head. Farther back, two young guys whispered and laughed, treating it like a game. The room split along a quiet fault line, some sick with disgust, others feeding off the swagger. Hargrove wanted heat. He wanted Malcolm to erupt. Answer me, boy, he spat, making the word a weapon. Or are you scared? Malcolm was still a statue. Only his eyes shifted, a slight adjustment to meet Hargrove's stare head on. In that glance there was something anchored, an inner keel that didn't budge. Clayton's jaw jumped, the smirk faltering before hardening into something meaner. He pushed up from his chair, ignoring the hissed warnings from the prosecutor. 3 heavy steps carried him across polished stone. Malcolm didn't flinch. He turned, measuring Clayton's approach like a trained man choosing not to move. Then the line was crossed. Clayton's palm hit Malcolm's shoulder. A driven shove, not enough to topple, enough to humiliate. Hands on a defendant in open court, like dignity were optional. A few in the benches shot to their feet, outrage written on their faces. Others gave nervous laughter, unsure what they were witnessing. Boyd half rose, voice trembling. Your Honor, and stalled. Judge Langford hesitated, gavel hovering mid-air. For a long breath he just watched, the room's disbelief thick as humidity. A white officer had shoved a black defendant in plain view of the bench, and authority stalled. Clayton's smile sharpened. What's wrong, Reddick? He taunted. Where's that Navy power now? Malcolm didn't lift a hand. He didn't bark back. He straightened an inch, eyes unbroken, body language still controlled, like a locked door, tested, not failing. If you watched closely, you could see the change in his hands, fingers curling a hair tighter, veins lining his forearms, strength tensed but bridled. Not fury unleashed, fury mastered. The gallery felt it. Laughter dried up. Whispers thinned. People realized they weren't seeing a beaten man. They were watching someone capable of ending this swiftly, choosing not to. Clayton either missed it or hated it, and so his grin grew bolder, mistaking discipline for surrender. He thought he'd won, proven something. What he'd actually punctured was the illusion of fairness. Judge Langford's weak rap of the gavel couldn't pace the break. The line was crossed. The weather was changing. Everyone had expected an explosion, a SEAL refusing public humiliation. Instead, Malcolm's restraint redrew the map. He lifted his eyes like a level, cool and steady, and the quiet pressed down. He'd trained to hold still when stillness mattered more than striking. The stillness rippled. Two jurors exchanged uneasy glances. The bailiff near the door straightened as if a pressure system shifted. In the back row, three older black men, posture crisp with the memory of service, leaned in, their faces set in knowing lines. They didn't gasp, they didn't cluck, they nodded. They had carried that quiet before, in jungles and deserts, where breathing right could be the difference. One murmured, "He's waiting." Man's bracing for the right second word seeped beyond the doors. A few who'd slipped out earlier filtered back after hallway whispers. Reporters leaned forward, phones primed, cameras warming. "Seal shamed in court," someone muttered, and the phrase traveled like a rumor on rails. The building felt alive, heartbeat in stone. Inside, Clayton mistook the quiet for victory. He leaned closer, knife-edged voice. "All muscle, no backbone. Navy can't change what you were born. You'll always be beneath men like me." The insult landed ugly and heavy. A woman near the front shook her head, breathing, "This isn't justice. This is theater." Malcolm's chest rose and fell in an even cadence, jaw set like hewn rock. The silence deepened to the point of ache. The long pause before weather breaks. Judge Langford finally tapped the gavel again. "Order. Maintain order." The authority sounded worn thin. He didn't scold Clayton. He didn't mention the shove. He dusted chaos like lint. Clayton nodded toward the judge with a show of obedience, then turned back to Malcolm with the old grin. "What's the matter, Reddick? Cat got your tongue?" For the first time, Malcolm leaned an inch toward Boyd, who sat pale and rigid beside him. Boyd's hands trembled on his notes. Malcolm's lips barely moved. Voice low and precise, meant only for his lawyer. Just a few more minutes. Boyd blinked, searching Malcolm's face for panic, and found none. What he found unsettled him more. Calm like a man with information others didn't have. Boyd swallowed and leaned back, unsure whether to push or trust. He chose trust this once. The whisper changed the chemistry of the room. Malcolm wasn't cornered. He was timing something. Back in the last row, the veterans exchanged glances, sharper now. One let out a slow exhale, almost a laugh without joy. "He knows. Watch him. That man isn't finished yet." The gallery leaned forward in a shared wordless lean, as if every heartbeat stretched the wire tighter. The faint buzz of reporters outside bled through the wood like bees behind a wall. The courthouse had become a stage, and everyone sensed they were only at the prelude. Clayton still didn't see it, or refused to. He stepped back enough to spread his arms as if addressing a crowd. "This is the Navy's best. Can't even speak up in a courtroom." A few chuckled, more flinched. No one looked away. Malcolm, calm and unyielding, kept his eyes on Clayton. That stare wasn't empty. It was a signal, not to the room, not even to Boyd, but to something beyond those walls, drawing closer with every tick. No one realized that when he whispered, "A few more minutes," the plot had turned a corner. He wasn't stuck. He was holding his ground, waiting for the exact second the hinge would swing. The courtroom throbbed with that tight silence specific to places where judgment falls. Then it happened. The double doors blasted open like a gust. The cadence of boots struck stone in a crisp, inexorable rhythm. A unit of military police poured in, uniforms pressed sharp as creases, movements clean enough to slice air. At their head, Lieutenant Colonel Rafael Herrera moved like gravity had switched hands, bringing with him the kind of authority a gavel can't mimic. Air pressure shifted. A minute earlier, Clayton had been the loudest thing in the room. Now his color drained as he turned. Reporters scrambled, shutters firing like lightning forks. Spectators craned, gasps riding the noise like foam on a wave. For the first time, Judge Langford stiffened as though the bench had lost ballast. The gavel hovered, impotent. Herrera's voice cut through, low and unarguable, quieting paper and throat in a single sentence. "Malcolm Reddick, he said, each word a stone. "We're here under direct orders from the Department of Defense." The effect was immediate, a shock wave across the benches. It wasn't just soldiers in a civilian hall. It was the weight behind the insignia. This wasn't a polite invitation, it was a fact rearranging the room. Clayton swallowed, bravado slipping like a mask. He had mocked and shoved a man he thought cornered. The floor moved under him. Malcolm didn't flinch. He lifted his chin a fraction and gave Herrera a small nod, calm as if this moment fit a plan. The MPs fanned out with choreography, two stepping behind Malcolm, not to cuff but to stand guard, shields instead of chains. That silent choice said everything the court refused to acknowledge. Malcolm Reddick wasn't abandoned. He had a wall at his back. Outside, the crowd thickened, a ripple of chants nudging the courthouse windows. News sprinted down the steps. A decorated SEAL, openly demeaned in court, was now under military protection. The story had outrun the oak and plaster, threading its way into every lens and microphone. Inside, Judge Langford cleared his throat and found no words that fit. The old authority felt like a stage prop now, while the new center of gravity wore boots and discipline. Clayton's jaw worked. He flicked his eyes at the bench, hoping for rescue. But the gavel looked like wood and nothing more. He stayed rooted, rattled by men who had inverted his afternoon. Through it all, Malcolm remained quiet. Silence had ceased to read as weakness. It sat in the room with weight. People felt it, a calm louder than insults, steadier than a shaky tap of authority, stronger than any rule bent out of shape. Herrera nodded once and stepped to Malcolm's flank. "You're under our protection," he said. "You won't stand alone here." The sentence didn't just belong to Malcolm. It nodded itself to every veteran watching, every bystander fed up, every reporter ready to beam the picture out. The morning had started with the scale loaded against one black man, suspicion and mockery stacked high. In a breath, the weight shifted, and you could feel it in the ache of the silence. Whatever came next, it wouldn't snap back to the way it was. For a long beat, no one moved. Eyes fixed on the soldiers at Malcolm's back, the room figured out what it was seeing. Then from the side benches, another figure stood. Captain Andres Rivera, broad-shouldered in dress uniform, had come for a different matter altogether. His eyes found Malcolm, recognition hitting quick and clean. He cleared his throat and spoke without waiting for leave. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady with a thread of emotion, "I know this man." A murmur rolled the room. Rivera squared his shoulders, gaze locked on Malcolm. "I served with him," he said, louder now. "Out in the desert when my unit was pinned and everything looked like the end. Malcolm Reddick pulled us out. He saved us all. I'm standing here because of him." The words landed like a thunderhead. Insults, slurs, the shove. Every petty cruelty buckled under testimony. No one could dismiss as theater. Faces changed. The smirks evaporated. Those who had sighed with pity sat up straighter, realizing the man in chains wasn't a spectacle. He was a rescuer who'd never asked applause. Clayton, sideswiped by the revelation, burst, "That's a lie! He's covering for one of his own." His voice cracked as he jabbed a shaking finger toward Rivera. The MPs stepped forward, their presence slicing his protest. "Order!" one barked, not a question. The gavel finally hit wood. Even that strike sounded thinner than before. The authority didn't live up there anymore. Outside, the energy climbed a ladder. Reporters spit words into microphones, breathless. "Breaking!" Decorated SEAL humiliated in court, revealed as a battlefield hero by fellow officer. Cameras flickered like a storm of fireflies. Phones streamed. The narrative leapt across screens as fast as fingers could swipe. At the center, Malcolm sat still, not modesty as pose, but as core. He didn't stand to soak in praise, didn't thump a chest. He bowed his head just slightly, the way people do when gratitude feels heavier than pride. Those hands that had tightened in restraint a few minutes earlier settled quietly on the table again. That humility explained him far better than any speech. It was more than refusing to dive into Clayton's muck. It was grace under the weight of sacrifice, refusing to bill the world for what he'd paid. You could feel the room catch it. A few eyes watered. Others just listened to the quiet and let it rearrange their insides. Clayton seemed smaller now, his tantrums bouncing off stone like rubber balls in a sanctuary. No amount of noise could erase what Rivera had named out loud. And Malcolm Reddick, calm, guarded by soldiers, anchored in silence, let the room sit with it, as the story outside kept growing like a wave with no shore. Judge Langford finally found his gavel again and tapped once, the sound small against the sudden hush. "Order," he said, throat tight. "We will maintain order." Yet he didn't rebuke Hargrove, didn't mention the shove, didn't name the slurs. He tried to sweep chaos off the table like crumbs. The attempt rang hollow. Power had migrated, and everyone felt it. Even the ceiling lights seemed to buzz differently, as if the building itself had switched who it listened to. Hargrove dipped his head toward the bench, feigning respect, then pivoted back with that practiced curl of a grin. "What's wrong, Reddick? Cat got your tongue?" he said, hoping volume could reinstall yesterday's pecking order. Malcolm finally leaned an inch toward Terry Boyd. The words were barely a breath. "Give it a couple more minutes." Boyd froze, searching his client's face like a map. He found no panic there, only timing, resolve, and a strange collected certainty. The whisper spread not by sound, but by feeling. Those veterans in the back shifted again, eyes narrowing with recognition. One murmured, "He's coordinating something, watch." Reporters near the doors shot glances at each other, composing phrases they didn't yet understand. The bailiff by the wall adjusted his stance. Even a few jurors sat straighter, as if some unseen tide had turned. Hargrove missed all of it. He mistook the compression of the room for submission, not prelude. Outside, the stone steps were filling. Word of uniforms in a civilian courtroom traveled at street speed. Microphones rose on poles like iron flowers. Someone live streamed on a shaky phone, breathless captions stacking like unsupervised subtitles. Inside, Langford pressed his lips thin. "Counsel, proceed," he said, but his voice didn't carry far. The prosecutors huddled in pointed whispers, eyes pinging between optics and brass. Boyd uncurled his fingers, set his pen down, and chose, for once, not to interrupt the moment. Hargrove spread his arms like a cheap showman. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Navy's finest," he said, turning himself into a spectacle again. "Can't even stand up for himself." The line landed flimsier than before. The room's temperature had changed. A woman near the aisle muttered, "Enough." The veterans didn't blink. Malcolm kept that same stillness, not cowed, not angry, measured. It carried an arithmetic weight. Every provocation added nothing. Every second brought something closer. Judge Langford dabbed the bridge of his nose with a folded handkerchief, buying seconds he couldn't afford. "We will proceed according to law," he said, eyes sliding toward Lieutenant. "Colonel Herrera," as if the statute book had grown a backbone and boots. Herrera didn't reply. He didn't need to. His unit's posture answered for him, watchful, controlled, certain. The prosecutor cleared his throat and began a hesitant line of questions, but even he seemed to be listening for footsteps. "Mr. Reddick," the prosecutor ventured, "did you—" He cut himself short as another murmur rippled from the gallery. Outside, the chant thickened, coming in through the door like distant surf. Hargrove rolled his shoulders, trying to reclaim his earlier swagger. Malcolm's gaze never left him. There was no contempt in it, no fear, just a steadiness that made bravado look small. Terry Boyd rested a palm on the tabletop, grounding himself to his client's calm like plugging into a current. Clayton leaned closer, dropping his voice to something private and poisonous. "Tell them you're nothing without that trident," he hissed. Malcolm didn't take the bait. He looked past Hargrove toward the doors, as if tracking a clock only he could see. Boyd followed the glance and finally understood enough to keep still. He smoothed his tie, squared his notes, and waited with him. The prosecutor, missing the signal, drew breath to try again, and then the hinges answered. The double doors burst inward, and the cadence of boots returned, precise as a metronome. More military police swept in, expanding the perimeter like a closing frame. At their center, Herrera stepped forward, a folded packet in his hand. The room steadied into silence, like air before a thunderclap. Cameras clicked in jagged flurries. Per Defense Department directive, Herrera said, voice carried without strain. We are to assume protective custody of Petty Officer Malcolm Reddick for matters under federal authority. Gasps stitched across the benches. Protective custody, Herrera repeated, letting the words anchor. Effective immediately. Judge Langford opened his mouth, then closed it again, measuring statutes against realities. Colonel, he managed, this is a state proceeding. Herrera inclined his head. Understood, Your Honor. Our orders don't supersede your robe. They safeguard the man under these charges. He will appear as required and be protected while present. That obligation falls to us. Hargrove's face drained, then flushed. This is ridiculous, he snapped, half to the judge, half to the uniforms. You can't just waltz in. An MP near the aisle didn't raise a hand. He only turned his chin, and the sentence strangled itself. The prosecutor pinched the bridge of his nose, baffled by a chessboard he hadn't studied. Terry Boyd finally found his voice. Your Honor, defense welcomes any measures ensuring my client's safety. For once, no one scoffed at Boyd. Herrera handed an envelope to the clerk. The seal winked under the lights. The clerk read quickly, then passed it to the bench. Judge Langford scanned the directives, jaw flexing as he traced the authority chain. Very well, he said after a beat. This court will recess for 20 minutes to confer with counsel. He glanced at Malcolm, as if encountering him anew. Petty Officer Reddick will remain under guard. It sounded less like concession than recognition of gravity. The gavel tapped. The room exhaled. Conversations cracked open in hushed bursts. Reporters texted furiously. A few sprinted for the hallway. The veterans in the back rose together, dignity in the way they moved, as if answering a roll call only they could hear. Malcolm stayed seated, breathing even. Terry leaned in. You knew they were coming, he whispered. Malcolm's mouth ticked at the corner. I knew they should, he said. Didn't know if they would. Not bravado, just truth. Hargrove lingered near the prosecutor's table, pretending to straighten papers nobody needed. His hands shook despite himself. He kept peeking at Malcolm, like a man checking an old map against a new coastline. Outside chants swelled, snatches of "Protect our vets," weaving with calls for justice. An elderly woman touched the doorframe and crossed herself before stepping out. Terry watched her, some quiet resolve settling in his shoulders that hadn't been there when the morning started. In the corridor, microphones blossomed like wildflowers after rain. Breaking, someone said into a camera. Decorated seal placed under military protection mid-hearing after courtroom harassment. Another reporter countered, sources confirm a federal angle. The story ran ahead of itself, barefoot and fast. Inside, Herrera conferred softly with his sergeant, then placed two MPs at Malcolm's shoulders like parentheses. They weren't closing him in, they were bracketing him, making space where none existed. Langford returned before the 20 minutes expired, robes swaying, impatience and calculation sharing one shadow. We will resume, he announced. The benches rustled. He looked to the prosecution. Confine yourself to material facts, he warned, a belated boundary that made Hargrove's mouth tighten. Terry touched Malcolm's sleeve, a small permission-seeking gesture. Malcolm gave the slightest nod. He didn't need rescuing. He needed the field level long enough for truth to walk in, unarmed. The prosecutor rose. He tried a cleaner, narrower lane, but the earlier poison still colored the water. Every question tasted different after the shove, the slurs, the boots. Petty officer, he asked, on the night in question. The side door creaked, and another uniformed figure stood. Captain Andres Rivera stepped forward, hand raised politely. Your Honor, he said, voice steady, if the court will indulge a brief statement relevant to the defendant's character and record of service. The judge's eyes flicked to Herrera, then back. Brief, he allowed. Rivera squared himself, and the room seemed to square with him. Years ago, in Anbar province, he began, my platoon was pinned in a kill zone. Reddick was attached to a different element. He broke protocol to reach us, laid smoke, put himself between us and fire, and walked every one of my people out. I'm a father today because of that decision. You could feel the benches breathe. No violins, no grandstanding, just factual gratitude. Rivera set his jaw and added, he never asked for commendation. He refused it. The words stripped the theater from the proceedings like paint peeled by sun. Hargrove blurted, he's lying, and instantly regretted it. An MP turned his head, and silence fell like a curtain. The prosecutor didn't leap to save Clayton. He watched Rivera, doing the math of credibility in real time and finding his own questions smaller. Judge Langford nodded once, a concession to wait. Captain, your statement will be entered into the record as character testimony. He turned to the jury with care. You will treat it accordingly. Rivera gave a crisp acknowledgement and stepped back, eyes resting on Malcolm with brotherly recognition. Malcolm lowered his gaze, almost embarrassed, the way people look when a private sacrifice gets hauled into public light. He didn't bask under it. He endured it politely. Outside, the chant shifted from noise to chorus, reporters weaving Rivera's words into the narrative midstream. Saved an entire unit, someone said live. Inside, Hargrove's confidence curdled into something sour, resentment without a stage. Terry Boyd, who had arrived dutiful and timid, felt new sinew in his spine. He clicked his pen, stood, and objected cleanly when the prosecution tried to slide a leading insinuation past the line. The judge sustained without theatrics. The room's rules finally applied both ways. Herrera checked his watch and gave a small sign to his team, a gesture that meant nothing to laymen and everything to those trained to see. The MPs eased their geometry, present not looming. Malcolm rolled his shoulders once, the only visible indulgence to tension he'd allowed. A juror in the second row studied him with unguarded curiosity, the kind that precedes respect. The prosecutor gathered himself and decided to stop performing and start working. He narrowed his questions to dates, deployments, locations, reports, things that could be answered absent theater. Malcolm's responses were clipped, precise, neither defensive nor triumphant. Hargrove simmered, trapped between rules and the fact that every outburst now wounded his side. The veterans in the back exchanged the smallest nods, like a quiet committee noting that the tide had turned, not by shouting, but by steadiness, reinforcement, and the right testimony at the right moment. At a lull, Judge Langford regarded Malcolm over his glasses, a long, appraising look stripped of earlier suspicion. Petty officer, he said, voice even, you will continue to receive the full protection of this court while these proceedings continue. It was late, maybe, but it mattered. Terry glanced sideways, surprised to feel grateful for a basic thing. Malcolm answered with a single nod. No triumph in it, only acknowledgement, as if civility were a bridge lately repaired. A phone buzzed loudly in the gallery, and was silenced by three glares at once: bailiff, veteran, reporter. Outside, the crowd had grown to a steady drum. One hand-lettered sign read, "We see you." Another said, "Honor the ones who serve." The messages weren't about verdicts, they were about treatment. Inside, Herrera's team maintained their watch, the room breathing slower now, like collective blood pressure had dropped. For the first time all day, the space felt usable. Malcolm didn't bask in any of it. He sat with that unrattled posture, shoulders back, hands easy on the table, eyes soft, but awake. If you looked for pride, you didn't find it. If you hunted for anger, that wasn't there either. What lived behind his calm was discipline, habits forged under pressure, A man practiced at carrying weight without making others lift it. The quiet returned, warmer now, and the story outside kept moving on its own legs. He dipped his head slightly, as if Rivera's praise still felt like a shirt tailored for someone else. Those hands that had tightened to hold back a surge simply rested, open and steady. The gallery, wiser now, understood the difference between weakness and restraint. Clayton's earlier jeers echoed faintly, a child's noise in a vaulted room. And Malcolm Reddick, guarded but not trapped, calm but not passive, let the moment end without claiming it, dignity doing what volume never could. No slur could shrink the weight of Malcolm's record. The gallery no longer split into giggles and pity. It fused into a single, breath-held hush, a dawning awe that the man treated like less than human had, in fact, put his life on the line for others. He still didn't speak. His quiet wasn't emptiness. It was voltage. It was discipline, a steadiness forged under fire. In that stillness, truth spoke for him, cleaner, louder than any rebuttal he could have hurled back across those polished floors. The air still tingled from Captain Rivera's words when Lieutenant Colonel Rafael Herrera stepped forward again. His boots answered the marble with a slow, measured cadence. In his hands he carried a thick-sealed dossier stamped with the unmistakable crest of the Department of Defense. It wasn't waved like theater. It was carried like a responsibility. Shoulders squared, eyes steady, he advanced toward the bench. Paper and wax met wood. A hard fact was about to enter the record, indifferent to anyone's comfort. Herrera stopped at the bench, offered a crisp salute, and set the folder before Judge Everett Langford. "Your Honor," he said, voice unflinching, "this file has been cleared for disclosure under federal authority. Its contents concern Officer Clayton Hargrove." Langford's hand hovered as if the leather burned. For the first time that morning, the judge's lacquered composure showed a seam. He sensed, like the rest of us, that whatever lay inside wasn't procedural, it was consequential, and it would move the ground. He cracked the seal. Paper whispered like dry leaves in a windless yard. What slid into view wasn't tidy bureaucracy. It was a trail, ugly, verifiable, and heavy with consequence. Page followed page, internal probes and complaints that never saw daylight, names, dates, statements by black residents who'd been beaten, threatened, belittled. The pattern was numbing in its sameness. Charges raised, evidence stacked, and then vanished, dismantled by hands with access, muffled by friends in rooms the public never enters. The benches stirred. Shock moved row to row like a brush fire. People craned to read the judge's eyes as he turned each page, his disbelief widening one careful fraction at a time. Then the live wire, newly unsealed material, detailing conduct far beyond crude intimidation. There it was in black and white. Hargrove orchestrating spurious counts, steering reports, leaning on subordinates to conjure scenes that never happened, all to smear Malcolm Reddick clean off the map. This wasn't misconduct. It was sabotage. A low thunder of voices rolled through the room. Veterans in the back straightened. Someone's knuckles hit wood in fury. Outside, the rumor sluiced down the steps, faster than any gavel could ever catch. Langford read on, jaw tightening. Each paragraph pinned the same scheme to the same badge. False narratives, bent testimony, pressure applied where careers were soft. The pattern was industrial, repeatable, cynical, designed to survive scrutiny by never allowing real scrutiny to land in the first place. Then came the part no one could argue past, cross-checked logs and corroborating statements tying Hargrove's fingerprints to the very allegations leveled at Malcolm. Fabrication wasn't an accident. It was the plan. The chamber erupted, gasps, a few shouted curses, startled cries snapping at the corners. The veterans pounded the bench again, harder. Outside, the sidewalk found a single choir. "Justice for Reddick!" The chant climbed the stone, found the windows, and poured into the proceedings like weather. Clayton lost color fast. This "This is a setup," he sputtered, voice thin and shaking. "You can't prove—" But the sentence died, under the weight of stamped pages resting open in full view. Langford pounded for order. The gavel sounded small in the swell. Authority didn't live in that wooden mallet anymore. It lived in documentation and in boots that had brought it to light. For the first time, the judge looked cornered, unsure whether the room would heed him at all. Through it, Malcolm didn't move. He didn't rise or clench a fist. He watched Clayton with an even, almost sorrowing gaze. No flicker of triumph, no smirk of payback. The restraint said everything. This wasn't vengeance. It was exposure. It was a ledger dragged into daylight. The contrast landed hard. Clayton unraveling in panic. Malcolm steady as stone. The people saw it, felt it, and a larger mirror appeared. This wasn't just about two men. It was about a machinery in need of reckoning. Sweat gathered at Langford's hairline as he closed the folder with careful hands. He looked from Herrera to Malcolm, then back to Hargrove, like a man seeking a dry rock in rising water. The bench had been the highest ground all morning. Now it felt ankle deep. He cleared his throat, voice wobbling once, before finding its line. This court cannot proceed under current jurisdiction. In light of this record, referral to federal authority is required. He lifted the gavel. Proceedings are suspended. The sentence thudded through the chamber. The floor plan of the case redrew itself in an instant, from county theater to federal audit. The shelter Clayton had counted on would not follow him to the next building. Outside, the chant doubled, a rolling pressure that made the windows hum. Inside, energy flashed, journalists scribbling like their wrists might give out, vets exchanging sober nods, citizens holding phones high, catching proof that felt overdue. Malcolm, still silent, let the truth carry the room. His quiet outvoiced Clayton's denials, outvoiced the chant itself, outvoiced a gavel that had spent the morning ignoring its own duty. It was the quiet of a man who never needed to pose, who had already passed harder tests than this room could imagine. Clayton's face swung from pallor to fever red. His jaw worked as if chewing glass. He slammed a fist against the table. "Lies! Every last bit!" Cameras snapped, pens flew. The spectacle didn't help him. It exposed him further. The gallery jerked toward the noise, half in shock, half in morbid fascination. The roar evaporated almost instantly, swallowed by a steadier voice. Terry Boyd didn't blink. He closed his file, rose as if unbothered by gravity, and said, clear enough to carry, "No, Officer Hargrove. This isn't a lie. This is accountability." The line cut cleaner than any shout. Clayton rocked back a step, like he'd taken a hit. His eyes searched the room for allies, and found none left standing. For years he'd rested behind the badge, influence. A family name passed like a shield. Stripped of that insulation, he looked smaller, a man who'd mistaken fear for authority. The silence grew heavy enough to bow the rafters. Then his voice cracked open, scratching out something raw. "My father was a cop," he blurted. "He taught me. Men who look like Reddick are dangerous. He said they're the enemy. And his throat hitched. I believed him. The confession hit like cold steel. The room froze. Even the fluorescents seemed to hold their hum. The admission didn't crash like rage. It traveled like a thin echo, bouncing off ribs and landing in the quiet no one had words for. Malcolm finally lifted his eyes and truly saw Clayton, not as a foe, but as a squandered possibility. No vindication crossed his face, only a deep, human sadness. His gaze said what he wouldn't. You could have chosen better. Mercy without absolution. Judgment without hate. Clayton flinched under it. Strength drained from his shoulders as if a valve had opened. The bluster that once filled the room collapsed into something smaller. Shame in a man who'd never named it. Around us something softened. A woman in front dabbed at tears. A reporter's pen stilled mid-scratch. Even the bailiff shifted, recalibrating what he thought he knew about villains and damage. Understanding crept in, but justice doesn't dissolve just because understanding arrives. Herrera knew both things could coexist. He gave a tight nod. The MPs closed in, not abrupt, not humiliating, only certain. Boots thudded a firm rhythm that left no space for misinterpretation. Clayton didn't resist. The ignition was gone. The engine idled out. The cuffs clicked. Metal's small report louder than any theatrics. Well, years of swagger ended on that single sound. Boyd stacked his papers in exacting order, offering no victory lap. The silence that followed his gesture landed like a verdict more final than speech. Judge Langford, so decisive on routine days, searched for language and found very little. The gavel hovered, then lowered without striking. His eyes flicked to Malcolm, and back to Clayton, the realization settling that command had moved on without him. When the MPs guided Hargrove toward the doors, he lifted his head once and scanned the benches. He didn't find anger or sympathy. He found faces wet with grief for the harm he represented, a sorrow too old to keep carrying. Something in him recognized it. His lips parted, but nothing arrived. Silence finally admitted what bluster never would, defeat owned by its author. Malcolm remained seated, hands resting easy, no gloat, no grin, a witness to balance returning. Justice to him meant scales that worked again, not a chance to reverse weight. The heavy doors sighed closed, and the room exhaled together. People wiped eyes. Others stared at the grain in the wood, thinking of choices and their long shadows. A reporter whispered, "Even the villain was victimized." The phrase hung half true, half dangerous. Under it ran a harder line. Having been taught poison doesn't absolve you for serving it. Sympathy is real and insufficient. Costs still come due, and today's ledger got tallied in daylight. In that washed out quiet, the morning felt less like a win or a loss and more like a reckoning, a recalibration about what we let badges excuse and what discipline looks like when it's real. Federal court changed the air. The same wood, the same flags, but a different gravity. This bench belonged to Judge Alan Whitmore, 60ish, meticulous, known for fairness that didn't bend and order that didn't tremble. One sweep of his gaze set the room straighter. Nobody misread who controlled this space. The gallery filled fast, reporters pinned at the back, veterans in dress blues shoulder to shoulder with civilians whose eyes held both skepticism and hope. A nation's mood condensed to one room. The United States stepped in through Assistant U.S. Attorney Carla Martinez, 40, precise, voice like a clean blade. No preamble. She set the timeline, pulled witness statements into sequence, and pointed to footage from the earlier hearing where Clayton's outburst played in damning clarity. "What you will see," she told the jury, "is not merely an assault on one man, but an assault on the premise of justice itself." No tremor touched her delivery. She didn't ride the emotion, she anchored it. But it wasn't Martinez who held the room the longest. It was Malcolm, taking the stand for the first time in this new venue. When he rose, the scuff of dress shoes on polished floor sounded louder than it should. He stood tall, shoulders squared, not theatrical, just military habit surviving 1,000 days. He looked at the jurors, then at Judge Whitmore, and began. His tone ran steady beneath the surface, like current under glassy water, unshowy, unafraid, unspun. "He hurled words I won't repeat here," Malcolm said. "He mocked my skin, my service, everything I've sworn to protect. I didn't answer with hate, couldn't. I've spent my life defending a country we have to share. I wasn't going to betray that uniform by mirroring his contempt." The room leaned in on its own. The absence of theater made the story heavier, not lighter. Truth unadorned has a way of filling corners propaganda can't reach. Then came another uniform. Sergeant Luis Navarro took the stand, blues pressed, gaze quiet and direct. He faced Malcolm first, a small nod, between men who've seen dust and night together, then turned to the jury. "That man," he said, pointing gently, "dragged my team out when we were boxed in and running out of luck." He didn't hesitate. "Some of us are alive because he moved when he did. I'm one of them. That's not a story. It's my life." No glory notes, no swelling rhetoric, just one soldier validating another without ornament. You could feel the ripple, respect settling across strangers. Outside, the storm had already gathered. News trucks bracketed the block, satellite dishes craned skyward, chyrons screamed in caps from coast to coast. Decorated black seal demeaned in court, federal case opens, editorials stacked up, commentaries collided. The veteran community closed ranks, every shade, every creed, writing letters, holding vigils, raising flags like prayers in a hard wind. Inside, Whitmore recentered the room whenever heat tried to creep in. When defense counsel floated the idea that Clayton's slurs were heat of the moment, the gavel dropped like a hammer on an anvil. This court will not mislabel hatred as passion, Whitmore said, and the silence that followed felt like an education. Malcolm returned to counsel table, quiet again. His silence didn't tuck him away. It insisted the rest of us sit with our noise and ask who we were. By day's end, Martinez slid papers into their exact stacks and looked across the well. She knew something had shifted that went beyond exhibits. Jurors had witnessed brutality in technicolor and dignity in grayscale, and the latter weighed more. The fight wasn't finished, but the tide had turned in a way that doesn't swing back easily. When Whitmore adjourned, murmurs swelled. Some wept openly, others covered their mouths, as if sound itself might undo the clarity they'd just seen. Outside, chants found harmony, veterans, activists, neighbors, voices braided into one rope, pulling toward a future they wanted to inhabit. The case of Malcolm Reddick escaped the docket and became a national question. What kind of justice will America endorse when racism has smudged every margin of the page? Crowds stayed, candles trembling in cupped hands, flags clutched to chests. And in living rooms, families argued softly, cried harder, or fell silent, listening to the question, refused to leave. The next session began in a hush you could hold. Marshals brought Clayton in shackled, chin trying for altitude. Pride wasn't armor anymore. It was a thin coat in winter. Everyone sensed we were walking into the last page of a chapter. Whitmore sat a little higher, gavel resting within easy reach. The weight in the room wasn't menace, it was finality, the awareness that process, boring, stubborn process, can still carry justice to the finish line if you let it. Families of service members, local organizers, reporters with pens perched, their focus made the air feel taut. Clayton's eyes flicked toward the jury, then away. Then the desperate last lunge. He erupted, voice cracking on the jagged edge. He's nothing but a black man in a uniform. The words sleeted across the chamber, ugly, revealing, fatal. Time stuttered. The bailiff froze mid-step. Even the HVAC seemed to stop its soft exhale, as if the room refused to breathe that in. All eyes slid to Malcolm. He rose slowly, not to counterpunch, but like a man answering a roll call. No anger found his face, only the same composure that had carried him through the day and the desert and the push-pull of a country he still claimed. He stepped once, chains of Clayton's sentence still clattering in the air, and spoke. "No," he said, voice firm but even. "I am a sailor, an American, and today, justice is the one that wins." He didn't raise the volume. He didn't need to. The words fell with the clean weight of iron on stone. Heads bowed, shoulders shook. People nodded like he'd offered a phrase they'd been struggling to find in their own mouths. Clayton's frame emptied out, arrogance bleeding away to reveal a scared man who had mistaken hatred for gravity. He sagged into his chair, lips trembling, as the scaffolding he'd leaned on dissolved, one rotten plank at a time. Whitmore didn't delay. "Officer Clayton Hargrove," he said, voice ringing clear, "this court finds you guilty on all counts." He didn't savor it. He stated it. "You are stripped of badge, title, and authority. You will serve a lengthy term in federal custody with no possibility of early release." Justice didn't roar. It spoke and stood. The gavel cracked like thunder, contained in a single strike. Sound rolled through uniforms rising in silent salute, through hands clasping, through relief exhaled. No cheers followed. Not yet. The moment didn't want confetti. It wanted breath, acknowledgement, the release that comes after too long holding something heavy. Clayton slumped, less a villain now than a hollow outline where a man could have been. The slurs he'd used became a boomerang. They came back stripped of menace and full of consequence. Malcolm didn't grin. He didn't nod to cameras. He sat, spine unbroken, saying nothing because the essential things were already said. Outside, news spread in minutes. Crowds at the steps answered not with a carnival shout, but with a steadier rhythm. Chants of unity, of change, of dignity owed without begging. Veterans lifted flags higher, faces wet and proud. Reporters scrambled, aware that years from now someone would pull their footage and ask how the story got told. Inside, time stretched thin. What stuck wasn't the verdict alone. It was the way a simple sentence from Malcolm kept resonating like a bell. It wasn't just the end of a trial, it was the sound of a line drawn cleanly between what we claim we stand for and what we actually enforce. Malcolm rose when adjournment came. He put a hand on Rivera's shoulder, gratitude without performance. He turned to the gallery, veterans who had shown up, strangers who had offered voice, and gave a small nod that felt like a coin pressed into a palm. You could read it. Thank you. Keep going. This isn't finished, because the story didn't end at the threshold. The weeks that followed carried sentences and paperwork and transport chains, but something larger traveled with them. Clayton's badge disappeared into evidence, his authority into a file. The louder truth rose. Dignity doesn't crumble when hatred shouts. It hardens. Malcolm, no longer the defendant in headlines, became a marker people pointed to when skeptics asked whether restraint means surrender. His quiet answer lived on. Strength isn't loud by necessity, it's steady by choice. When a journalist asked why he never struck back, Malcolm kept his answer small. Justice isn't hauled in by rage, he said. It's carried by patience and truth. The quote outpaced the verdict. It landed on breakfast tables and timelines in school assemblies and front porches after dinner. It traveled among veterans who understood the cost of calm and among teenagers who needed a different model for what courage looks like when someone tries to pull you into the mud. By then, the city had woven new rituals around the courthouse steps: candles most nights, flags some mornings, notes taped carefully to the railings. Thank you, we saw you, keep watch. It wasn't idolatry, it was gratitude, aimed at an idea wearing a man's face. Inside agencies and precincts, uncomfortable meetings ran long. Policies long ignored crawled back into the light. People asked which doors had allowed a Clayton to open so many others without ever being stopped. Whitmore kept his calendar moving, case to case. Very little commentary, plenty of clarity. Langford, to his credit, changed in small visible ways, less impressed by swagger, quicker to cut off side-mouth disrespect. Herrera rotated back to his post, but the unit still checked in. Christmas cards, a coin slid across a table, a nod at a Memorial Day ceremony. Rivera and Malcolm saw each other sometimes. No speeches, just the shorthand people share when they've met each other, under pressure. Terry Boyd didn't return to being timid. He found a spine he liked and kept it. In court, his objections landed earlier and cleaner. In life, he stopped apologizing for standing up in rooms where silence had once felt safer. Reporters moved on to new fires, but when anniversaries came around, they called Malcolm for a quote. He rarely obliged. When he did, he kept it brief. Make the rules work, he would say, and stop excusing people who don't. There were people who wanted a triumphal version of the story. Malcolm didn't give them one. He carried the scars the way he'd carried everything else, without show, without denial. The real victory, he insisted, wasn't his. It was a community refusing to be gaslit, institutions learning that order means little without equity, and a bench remembering its job under pressure. He shook hands. He returned salutes. He went home and checked on neighbors who never made the evening news. On the internet, the story became 1,000 versions, some accurate, many embellished. Malcolm ignored the noise. When asked to keynote, He often declined, sending a younger sailor instead, someone whose voice needed the room more than he did. When a small nonprofit asked for help funding counseling for vets, he showed up before dawn to set up folding chairs. People tried to thank him. He changed the subject and asked about their kids, then lifted the last table into the truck. He wasn't a saint. He got angry in private at headlines that sanitized, at acquaintances who suddenly always knew. He didn't perform that anger, because performing it would have felt like the same trap in a new costume. He ran at dawn when the streets were blue. He fixed a fence for the woman next door who never remembered his name, but always remembered to bring him peaches when they ripened. Mostly, he lived and let living be its own kind of answer. A year out, an organizer asked him to stand on the courthouse steps for a vigil. He said yes. He didn't speak. He held the flag while a Gold Star mother read names. After a kid in a junior ROTC polo asked for advice, Malcolm thought a second. Decide early what you won't trade, he said, then keep paying the price to keep it. The kid wrote it on his hand with a borrowed pen. Later, he tattooed it on his forearm. Clayton served time. He took mandatory programs, sat through counseling he once would have ridiculed. He wrote letters that went nowhere, apologized to empty rooms, learned that there's a difference between guilt that begs and responsibility that acts. No one celebrated his pain. No one excused his harm. Systems that enabled him faced audits, personnel changes, and lawsuits. Some of it stuck, some of it stalled. Changes like that, carved in inches, defended daily, always easier to pronounce than to practice. The city learned new reflexes. Courtrooms got quicker to close a mouth that dripped contempt. Young prosecutors realized the shape of a case isn't just evidence, it's the air you allow in the room. Judges who'd coasted on habit noticed they had choices at small moments. Bailiffs stopped letting just a little slide. Reporters train themselves to hear when words like passion are piled on to cover something that smells like rot. Incremental, imperfect, real. It added up where it mattered. As for Malcolm, he kept answering the same question differently each time. How'd you stay so calm? One man asked him in a grocery line, whispering like it was a church. Malcolm shrugged. Practice, he said, and remembering who I answer to. The man nodded, not entirely sure what that meant, then decided he did. At a school assembly, a kid asked if he'd forgiven Clayton. I don't get to hand out erasers, Malcolm said, but I don't carry his weight either. There were awards he declined, and two he accepted because the person pinning them on had earned the right to ask. He didn't do late night shows. He walked in the Memorial Day parade beside an empty wheelchair, carried to honor a friend. Afterward, he sat on a curb eating a paper plate of barbecue with Rivera, boots touching at the toes, talking about nothing important, which is to say everything important. Kids, busted faucets, a neighbor's new dog that hated fireworks. Sometimes, late, he replayed the moment in his head, the shove, the slur, the decision to hold still. He knew it wasn't magic, it was training, stubbornness, refusal to be edited by someone else's fear. He didn't romanticize it. Discipline is costly. It leaves marks you don't post. He'd chosen his cost. If there was any grace in it, it was that other people had chosen to pay too. Herrera, Martinez, Whitmore, the veterans in the last row who never blinked. Years stack. Headlines fade. The courthouse keeps doing what courthouses do. Some days splendidly, some days not. In a different room, a young public defender hears a cop try Clayton's script and cuts it off before the second beat. In another, an old judge retires early, citing family. Everyone reading the notice knows what the real reason is. Change keeps being the unglamorous thing it always was. People making decisions when no one is filming, then making them again tomorrow. And still, on certain nights, the clip of Malcolm saying, "Today justice wins," resurfaces. Someone shares it without context, and it still lands, not because it's perfect, there's no such thing, but because it's simple in a world that makes simple feel rare. It reminds a tired clerk to finish the appeal right. It nudges a precinct captain to reopen a complaint. It convinces a teenager to leave a party before a fight starts. Small ripples, measurable only if you're patient. Back where it started, the first courtroom got new bulbs, new rules on decorum, a new sign about respectful conduct that seems obvious until you need it. Langford sits a little quieter now, which is an improvement. The bailiff who once hesitated moves faster when lines are crossed. Terry Boyd teaches a workshop once a quarter on courtroom dynamics for public defenders. He starts every session the same way. The record isn't the transcript, it's the choices you force into it. On anniversaries, Malcolm walks the long way around the block, past the steps where the crowd first found a single voice. He pauses where the chalk messages had once layered like sediment: names, thanks, demands. The stone is clean, but the memory sticks. He doesn't stay long. He waves at the woman with peaches. He takes a call from a shipmate teaching a son to tie a tie. He feeds a stray dog someone else named, and he never did. He still won't tell the story the way people want it told. No arch, no fireworks. He keeps the messy parts intact because the messy parts are where the choices live. When kids ask about heroes, he aims them at nurses, at teachers showing up under fluorescent lights, at clerks who circle a mistake in pencil and correct it. Find a place to practice being decent, he tells them. Then don't wait for applause. If it matters, the work is the applause. A podcast clips his quote wrong and it goes briefly, uselessly viral. He ignores it. The nonprofit gets a new van. Rivera's daughter wins a scholarship essay contest, writing about the day a stranger's restraint saved her dad. Herrera sends a photo from a base on the other side of the world. Sunset over a runway. Boots in frame. A caption. Still watching. Martinez argues a case that doesn't trend and wins it anyway. Whitmore swears in A New Citizen with tears. On a humid evening, Malcolm stops by a tiny community center because a flyer asked for volunteers to repaint a room. He tapes a line. He dips a roller. A kid blasts music too loud. Somebody laughs. Somebody else brings lemonade. The wall takes two coats. The floor gets speckled on accident. When they're done, the room looks like a place where good things might happen. Nobody calls the news. Nobody needs to. The work is ordinary, and it's enough. If there's a moral, he refuses to make it tidy. He knows plenty of men who did everything right and still lost, and others who did little and were given much. He knows how easily a room can tilt and how hard it is to straighten. He knows silence can be complicity and can be strength, depending on whether it shields the vulnerable or the comfortable. He keeps choosing the version that costs him, because that's the version that tends to heal. When a small channel asks to tell the story, he says okay on one condition. No hero edits, they keep the jagged parts. They keep the bench's failure before its repair. They keep Clayton's confession and Clayton's sentence and Clayton's after. They keep the veterans' steady backs. They keep the moments where nothing happens except someone deciding not to flinch. When the segment airs, it reaches living rooms that never watch national news. It starts quieter conversations that might last longer. The host asks him at the end what power is. He thinks for a breath. Integrity, he says, the kind you can't rent and can't sell. He doesn't look at the camera. He looks at the kid running sound who is pretending not to listen and is listening hard. The clip doesn't spike views. It sits in a library of moments people pull for themselves when the room tilts and they need to remember what steady felt like once before. So if this story found you, lend your shoulder, boost what's worth hearing, share what helps people stand a little taller, support the places telling these stories with care. Around here, they call it Max Stories. Call it whatever you want. Just keep it going. The work isn't glamorous, but it's good. Every post, every pass along, every donation to the right folks keeps a small light on. And small lights make maps when the city feels dark for longer than it should. That's our finish for today. Malcolm's Road reminds us courage rarely looks like spectacle. More often it looks like refusing to answer contempt with contempt and choosing to anchor the room, not ignite it. His isn't just his story. It's a mirror held up at chest height, asking what we'll do next time the floor lists. If this moved you, don't leave it on the screen. Carry it into your circles, your feeds, your meetings. Help tighten the bolts that came loose. If you want more, help us keep telling. Tap like, share it with someone who needs ballast, subscribe so you catch the next one. Every small gesture is a hand on the rope, hauling toward better. Around here, we say every story carries a heartbeat, and every heartbeat deserves to be heard. We mean it. Thanks for being here, for paying attention, for believing that restraint can be power, and that justice done plainly still deserves a standing room and a long echo. 4 lessons from Malcolm Reddick's day in court. Lesson 1: the quiet that holds the line. Most of us who've lived a while know the difference between noise and strength. We've watched loud men run out of steam and quiet people carry the day. When Malcolm Reddick walked into that courtroom, hands folded, back straight, face calm, some mistook his silence for surrender. They were wrong. His quiet was the same quiet you feel in a well-built house when a storm hits the siding. It's not inaction, it's construction. You could hear the room try to bait him, slurs thrown like rocks, a shove meant to make him break. Many of us remember being told as children to count to 10. Anyone who's survived real trouble knows sometimes you have to count to 100, and sometimes you just have to breathe slow and keep your feet under you. Malcolm did that in front of everyone. He didn't answer contempt with contempt. He didn't flail. He didn't rush to win the moment and lose the day. For folks 65 and older who've held families together, buried loved ones, and kept going, that posture is familiar. You know what it costs to stay steady when someone is trying to knock you off balance. You know that stillness isn't weakness, it's work. When the officer called him boy, Malcolm didn't reclaim his dignity by shouting. He reclaimed it by refusing to hand it over in the first place. That choice shifted the air. Veterans in the back row recognized it immediately. They didn't cheer. They nodded. Because restraint is not the absence of power, it's the mastering of it. And once a room sees that kind of control, it can't unsee it. If you've ever held your tongue so truth could arrive with witnesses instead of with a fist, you know the power Malcolm carried. Quiet is not empty, quiet is loaded. In the right hands, it's ballast. Lesson 2: paper, process, and the long road, called accountability. People love fireworks, but a lot of justice is pencil work. It's numbered pages, signatures with dates, seals you can hold in your hand, and a record that survives tempers. When Lieutenant Colonel Herrera stepped in with military police and a sealed federal file, the courtroom learned a simple truth older Americans teach their grandkids: save your receipts. That dossier didn't win the day because it was flashy. It won because it was verified. It traced a pattern of conduct, not a rumor, not a hunch, documented over time. We saw a judge who had been slow to act read page after page and feel the floor move under his bench. You could watch the math happen on his face. Allegations become evidence. Evidence becomes obligation. Accountability is usually slow. It's not the sprint to the microphone. It's the walk to the clerk's window. It's the 20-minute recess that turns into a referral. It's a prosecutor who stops performing and starts asking for dates, logs, reports. Some of us have learned the hard way that you can shout yourself hoarse and change nothing, but one well-kept file can knock a door off its hinges. In that room, the gavel was loud and weak. The paper was quiet and strong. Older Americans know the terrain. You've fought insurance companies with organized folders. You've challenged a bad bill with notes from every call. You've written down names, times, and what was said because you learned, sometimes painfully, that if it isn't written, it didn't happen. The lesson was plain. Process isn't the enemy, it's the bridge. When the judge finally said, "This court cannot proceed under current jurisdiction," that wasn't a retreat. It was the system remembering how to stand. Federal court, new judge, new rules, but not new values, just values that were finally enforced. And if you've ever waited months for a fair decision, you know how stubborn, boring process can still carry justice across the finish line. Inch by inch, signature by signature. Lesson 3. People change the air pressure. If you were in that gallery, you felt it. One human being can warm a room, but a community can change the temperature. This story didn't turn only because Malcolm was disciplined or because a file was stamped. It turned because people showed up in uniforms and church clothes with notebooks and handmade signs. Veterans in the last row held a line with their posture. Reporters aimed lenses that made the room behave better. A captain stepped forward and spoke a simple, verifiable truth. I'm alive because of him. Outside, neighbors chanted not for a verdict, but for dignity. Inside, the bailiff straightened, jurors sat taller, and even a timid defense lawyer found a spine. We forget sometimes that showing up is not decoration, it's leverage. Many of you have stood in hospital waiting rooms, school board meetings, and city halls. You've learned that authorities act differently when the community is watching. Not because watching is threatening, but because it's clarifying. The presence of witnesses reduces the space for nonsense. In that courthouse, Lieutenant Colonel Herrera and his MPs didn't menace the room. They steadied it. Their boots said, "We're not here to throw our weight around. We're here to keep the scale from being tipped." And then the testimonies from Rivera and later Navarro did what clean testimony does. They closed the gap between rumor and reality. Out on the steps, the crowd didn't demand a crown for Malcolm. They demanded a fair shake. That's a deeply American reflex. We line the parade route for the Little League team. We sign a casserole list when a neighbor is sick. We hold candles when a family's name is on a headline. Those gestures aren't noise, they're architecture. If you've ever brought a lawn chair to a long hearing or mailed a letter to a shaky official, you've felt what the gallery felt. The air gets heavier with accountability when people lean in together. The lesson is simple and hard. You don't have to fix the whole system by yourself. Bring your body, your voice, your witness. It changes the air. Lesson 4. What endures? Daily courage, ordinary repair. The sentence that stuck wasn't the guilty verdict. It was Malcolm's. I am a sailor, an American, and today justice is the one that wins. That line traveled because it made the story bigger than two men and smaller than national spectacle. Bigger because it pointed to shared obligations, smaller because it fit into daily life. The weeks after the trial mattered just as much as the verdict. Malcolm didn't campaign for applause. He helped a nonprofit set up chairs at dawn. He told a teenager, "Decide early what you won't trade." He fixed a neighbor's fence. He showed up to hold a flag while a Gold Star mother read names. Older Americans will recognize that cadence. You've lived it. You know repair is not glamorous. It's repainting the scuffed wall, writing a check when no one's looking, and calling to make sure a policy actually changed in practice. It's reminding a judge, a principal, or a captain, politely, firmly, that respect isn't a style point, it's a requirement. And you also know something else the story told the truth about. Grace and accountability can stand in the same room. When Clayton spilled his ugly confession, the mood softened around him, but justice did not. He was cuffed without spectacle, and systems that had sheltered him were forced into audits. That combination matters. Compassion isn't a free pass, it's a way to stay human while you do necessary work. So, what do we carry forward? We carry the habit of steadiness, breathing before we blast. We carry the habit of record keeping, writing down what matters so the facts don't evaporate. We carry the habit of showing up, standing with others so rooms behave. And we carry the habit of ordinary repair, doing the small, unfancy things that keep our neighborhoods livable and our institutions honest. You don't need a uniform to do any of that. You don't need a big platform. You need a decision you make before the room tilts. I won't trade my integrity for speed or applause. Older Americans have long taught that lesson at kitchen tables and church basements, in VFW halls and union meetings. It still works. If you've ever carried a casserole up a flight of stairs, you already know how to carry a community. The story's final nudge was plain. Keep a small light on. Write the letter. Attend the hearing. Mentor the kid. Press the system without hate. And when the moment comes, and it will, hold the room instead of igniting it. That's not passivity, that's power, the kind you can't rent and you can't sell. When you look at these four lessons, one, choosing disciplined restraint when someone tries to bait you. Two, trusting paper, dates, and process to turn truth into action. Three, showing up with others so rooms behave better. And four, practicing everyday courage in small repairs. Which one do you feel our country needs most from you right now, and why? Think back on your own life, a time you bit your tongue so fairness could arrive, a folder you kept that finally made the difference, a meeting where your quiet presence changed the tone, or a humble favor that kept a neighbor standing. Share your story in the comments so others can learn from your hard won wisdom. If this conversation helped you sit up a little straighter, please tap like. It tells the algorithm to put more of this steady, no drama truth in front of folks who need it. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll catch future stories and practical takeaways without hunting for them. And pass this along to a friend or grandchild who could use a model of strength that isn't loud but lasts. Your voice, yes, yours, might be the nudge that steadies someone else's day.